Don't forget to subscribe. Afterwards, the wisest and most spiritual books from the greatest authors await you every day. And now buckle up, sit back and we'll begin. Helena Petrovna Blavatsky. The Secret Doctrine. Gods, Monads and Atoms. Some years ago we remarked that the esoteric doctrine may well be called the thread doctrine since, like Sutratma in the Vedanta philosophy, it passes through and strings together all the ancient philosophical religious systems and reconciles and explains them. We now say it does more. It not only reconciles the various and apparently conflicting systems, but it checks the discoveries of modern exact science, showing some of them to be necessarily correct, since they are found corroborated in the ancient records. All this will, no doubt, be regarded as terribly impertinent and disrespectful, a veritable crime of Lee's science. Nevertheless, it is a fact. Science is, undeniably, ultra-materialistic in our days, but it finds, in one sense, its justification. Nature behaving ever esoterically in actu, and being, as the Kabbalists say, in abscondito, can only be judged by the profane through her appearance, and that appearance is always deceitful on the physical plane. On the other hand, the naturalists refuse to blend physics with metaphysics, the body with its informing soul and spirit. They prefer to ignore the latter. This is a matter of choice with some, while the minority very sensibly strive to enlarge the domain of physical science by trespassing on the forbidden grounds of metaphysics, so distasteful to some materialists. These scientists are wise in their generation. For all their wonderful discoveries will go for nothing and remain forever headless bodies, unless they lift the veil of matter and strain their eyes to see beyond. Now that they have studied nature in the length, breadth, and thickness of her physical frame, it is time to remove the skeleton to the second plane and search within the unknown depths for the living and real entity, for its substance, the noumenon of evanescent matter. It is only by acting along such lines that some truths, now called exploded superstitions, will be discovered to be facts and the relics of ancient knowledge and wisdom. One of such degrading beliefs, degrading in the opinion of the all-denying skeptic, is found in the idea that cosmos, besides its objective planetary inhabitants, its humanities and other inhabited worlds, is full of invisible, intelligent existences. The so-called archangels, angels and spirits of the West, copies of their prototypes, the Dayanchohyans, the Devas and Pitras of the East, are not real beings, but fictions. On this point, materialistic science is inexorable. To support its position, it upsets its own axiomatic law of uniformity and of continuity in the laws of nature, and all the logical sequence of analogies in the evolution of being. The masses of the profane are asked and are made to believe that the accumulated testimony of history, which shows even the atheists of old, such men as Epicurus and Democritus, as believers in gods, is false, and that philosophers like Socrates and Plato, asserting such existences, were mistaken enthusiasts and fools. If we hold our opinions merely on historical grounds, on the authority of legions of the most eminent sages, Neoplatonists, and mystics in all ages, from Pythagoras down to the eminent scientists and professors of the present century, who, if they reject gods, believe in spirits, are we to consider such authorities to be as weak-minded and foolish as any Roman Catholic peasant who believes in and prays to his once human saint? Or the Archangel Saint Michael? But is there no difference between the belief of the peasant and that of the Western heirs of the Rosicrucians and alchemists of the Middle Ages? Is it the Van Helmonts, the Conraths, the Paracelsuses and Agrippas, from Roger Bacon down to St. Germain, who were all blind enthusiasts, hysteriacs or cheats? Or is it the handful of modern skeptics, the leaders of thought, who are struck with the necessity of negation? The latter is the case, we opine. It would indeed be a miracle, quite an abnormal fact in the realm of probabilities and logic, were that handful of negators to be the sole custodians of truth, while the million-strong hosts of believers in gods, angels, and spirits in Europe and America alone, namely, Greek and Latin Christians, theosophists, spiritualists, mystics, should be no better than deluded fanatics and hallucinated mediums, and often no higher than the victims of deceivers and impostors. However varying in their external presentations and dogmas, beliefs in the hosts of invisible intelligences of various grades have all the same foundation. Truth and error are mixed in all. The exact extent, depth, breadth, and length of the mysteries of nature are to be found only in Eastern esoteric science. So vast and so profound are these that scarcely even a very few of the highest initiates, those whose very existence is known, but to a small number of adepts, are capable of assimilating the knowledge. Yet it is all there, and one by one facts and processes in nature's workshops are permitted to find their way into exact science, while mysterious help is given to rare individuals in unraveling its arcana. It is at the close of great cycles, in connection with racial development, that such events generally take place. We are at the very close of the cycle of 5,000 years of the present Aryan Kali Yuga, and between this time and 1897, there will be a large rent made in the veil of nature, and materialistic science will receive a death blow. Without throwing any discredit upon time-honored beliefs in any direction, we are forced to draw a marked line between blind faith, evolved by theologies, and knowledge due to the independent researches of long generations of adepts, between, in short, faith and philosophy. There have been, in all ages, undeniably learned and good men who, having been reared in sectarian beliefs, died in their crystallized convictions. For Protestants, the Garden of Eden is the primeval point of departure in the drama of humanity, and the solemn tragedy on the summit of Calvary is the prelude to the hoped-for millennium. For Roman Catholics, Satan is at the foundation of cosmos, Christ in its center, and Antichrist at its apex. For both, the hierarchy of being begins and ends within the narrow frames of their respective theologies. One self-created personal God, and an emperor ringing with the hallelujahs of created angels, the rest, false gods, Satan and fiends. Theophilosophy proceeds on broader lines. From the very beginning of eons in time and space in our round and globe, the mysteries of nature, at any rate, those which it is lawful for our races to know, were recorded by the pupils of those same, now invisible, heavenly men in geometrical figures and symbols. The keys thereto passed from one generation of wise men to another. Some of the symbols thus passed from the east to the west, brought from the Orient by Pythagoras, who was not the inventor of his famous triangle. The latter figure, along with the square and circle, are more eloquent and scientific descriptions of the order of the evolution of the universe, spiritual and psychic, as well as physical, than volumes of descriptive cosmogonies and revealed genesis. The 10 points inscribed within that Pythagorean triangle are worth all the theogonies and angelologies ever emanated from the theological brain. For he who interprets these 17 points, the 7 mathematical points hidden on their very face, and in the order given will find in them the uninterrupted series of the genealogies from the first heavenly to terrestrial man. And, as they give the order of beings, so they reveal the order in which were evolved the cosmos, our earth, and the primordial elements, by which the latter was generated. Begotten in the invisible depths and in the womb of the same mother as its fellow globes, he who masters the mysteries of our own earth will have mastered those of all others. Whatever ignorance, pride or fanaticism may suggest to the contrary, esoteric cosmology can be shown to be inseparably connected with both philosophy and modern science. The gods and monads of the ancients from Pythagoras down to Leibniz and the atoms of the present materialistic schools, as borrowed by them from the theories of the old Greek atomists, are only a compound unit, or a graduated unity like the human frame, which begins with body and ends with spirit. In the occult sciences they can be studied separately, but they can never be mastered unless they are viewed in their mutual correlations during their life cycle, and as a universal unity during pralayas. Laplace shows sincerity, but gives a poor idea of his philosophical capacities when declaring his personal views on the monad or the mathematical point. He says, "A point is enough to put all the schools in the world in a combustion. But what need has man to know that point, since the creation of such a small being is beyond his power? A fortiori, philosophy acts against probability when, from that point which absorbs and disconcerts all her meditations, she presumes to pass on to the generation of the world." Philosophy, however, could never have formed its conception of a logical, universal, and absolute deity if it had had no mathematical point within the circle upon which to base its speculations. It is only the manifested point, lost to our senses after its pregenetic appearance in the infinitude and incognizable idea of the circle, that makes a reconciliation between philosophy and theology possible on condition that the latter should abandon its crude materialistic dogmas. And it is because Christian theology has so unwisely rejected the Pythagorean monad and geometrical figures that it has evolved its self-created human and personal God, the monstrous head whence flow in 2 streams, the dogmas of salvation and damnation. This is so true that even those clergymen who are Masons and who would be philosophers have, in their arbitrary interpretations, fathered upon the ancient sages the queer idea that the monad represented with them the throne of the omnipotent deity, placed in the center of the emperor to indicate Tgaotu Red, the great architect of the universe. A curious explanation this, more Masonic than strictly Pythagorean. Nor did the hierogram within a circle, or equilateral triangle, ever mean the exemplification of the unity of the divine essence, for this was exemplified by the plane of the boundless circle. What it really meant was the triune co-equal nature of the first differentiated substance, or the consubstantiality of the manifested spirit, matter, and the universe their son, which proceeds from the point, the real, esoteric logos, or Pythagorean monad. For the Greek monas signifies unity in its primary sense. Those unable to seize the difference between the monad, the universal unit, and the monads or the manifested unity, as also between the ever-hidden and the revealed logos, or the word, ought never to meddle with philosophy, let alone with the esoteric sciences. It is needless to remind the educated reader of Kant's thesis to demonstrate his second antinomy. Those who have read and understood it will see clearly the line we draw between the absolutely ideal universe and the invisible though manifested cosmos. Our gods and monads are not the elements of extension itself, but only those of the invisible reality, which is the basis of the manifested cosmos. Neither esoteric philosophy nor Kant, to say nothing of Leibniz, would ever admit that extension can be composed of simple or unextended parts. But theologian philosophers will not grasp this. The circle and the point, the latter retiring into and merging with the former, after having emanated the first 3 points and connected them with lines, thus forming the first nominal basis of the second triangle in the manifested world, have ever been an insuperable obstacle to theological flights into dogmatic emperance. On the authority of this archaic symbol, a male personal god, the creator and father of all, becomes a third-rate emanation, the Sephira standing fourth in descent, and on the left hand of Ein Sof, in the Kabbalistic tree of life. Hence, the monad is degraded into a vehicle, a throne. The monad, the emanation and reflection only of the point, or logos, in the phenomenal world, becomes, as the apex of the manifested equilateral triangle, the father. The left side or line is the duad, the mother regarded as the evil counteracting principle. The right side represents the son, his mother's husband, in every cosmogony, as being one with the apex. The baseline is the universal plane of productive nature, unifying on the phenomenal plane father, mother, son, as these were unified in the apex, in the supersensuous world. By mystic transmutation they became the quaternary, the triangle became the tetractys. This transcendental application of geometry to cosmic and divine theogony, the alpha and the omega of mystical conception, was dwarfed after Pythagoras by Aristotle. By omitting the point and the circle, and taking no account of the apex, he reduced the metaphysical value of the idea, and thus limited the doctrine of magnitude to a simple triad: the line, the surface, and the body. His modern heirs, who play at idealism, have interpreted these three geometrical figures as space, force, and matter, the potencies of an interacting unity. Materialistic science, perceiving but the baseline of the manifested triangle, the plane of matter, translates it practically as father, matter, mother, matter, and son, matter, and theoretically as matter, force, and correlation. But to the average physicist, as remarked by a Kabbalist, space and force and matter are what signs in algebra are to the mathematician, merely conventional symbols, or force is force and matter is matter, are as absolutely unknowable as is the assumed empty space in which they are held to interact. Symbols represent abstractions, and on these the physicist bases reasoned hypotheses of the origin of things. He sees three needs in what he terms creation: a place wherein to create, a medium by which to create, a material from which to create. And in giving a logical expression to this hypothesis through the terms space, force, matter, he believes he has proved the existence of that which each of these represents as he conceives it to be. The physicist who regards space merely as a representation of our mind, or extension unrelated to things in it, which Locke defined as capable of neither resistance nor motion, the paradoxical materialist, who would have a void there, where he can see no matter, would reject with the utmost contempt the proposition that space is a substantial though apparently an absolutely unknowable living entity. Such is, nevertheless, the Kabbalistic teaching, and it is that of archaic philosophy. Space is the real world, while our world is an artificial one. It is the one unity throughout its infinitude. In its bottomless depths as on its elusive surface, a surface studded with countless phenomenal universes, systems and mirage-like worlds. Nevertheless, to the Eastern occultist, who is an objective idealist at bottom, in the real world, which is a unity of forces, there is a connection of all matter in the plenum, as Leibniz would say. This is symbolized in the Pythagorean triangle. It consists of 10 points inscribed pyramid-like from 1 to 4 within its 3 sides, and it symbolizes the universe in the famous Pythagorean decade. The upper single point is a monad and represents a unit point, which is the unity whence all proceeds. All is of the same essence with it. While the 10 points within the equilateral triangle represent the phenomenal world, the 3 sides enclosing the pyramid of points are the barriers of nominal matter, or substance, that separate it from the world of thought. Pythagoras considered a point to correspond in proportion to unity, a line to 2, a superfice to 3, a solid to 4, and he defined a point as a monad having position and the beginning of all things. A line was thought to correspond with duality because it was produced by the first motion from indivisible nature and formed the junction of 2 points. A superfice was compared to the number 3 because it is the first of all causes that are found in figures, for a circle, which is the principle of all round figures, comprises a triad in center space circumference. But a triangle, which is the first of all rectilineal figures, is included in a ternary and receives its form according to that number, and was considered by the Pythagoreans to be the author of all sublunary things. The 4 points at the base of the Pythagorean triangle correspond with a solid or cube, which combines the principles of length, breadth, and thickness, for no solid can have less than 4 extreme boundary points. It is argued that the human mind cannot conceive an indivisible unit short of the annihilation of the idea with its subject. This is an error, as the Pythagoreans have proved, and a number of seers before them, although there is a special training needed for the conception, and although the profane mind can hardly grasp it. But there are such things as metamathematics and metageometry. Even mathematics pure and simple proceed from the universal to the particular, from the mathematical indivisible point to solid figures. The teaching originated in India and was taught in Europe by Pythagoras, who, throwing a veil over the circle and the point which no living man can define, except as incomprehensible abstractions, laid the origin of the differentiated cosmic matter in the base of the triangle. Thus the latter became the earliest of geometrical figures. The author of New Aspects of Life, dealing with the Kabbalistic mysteries, objects to the objectivization, so to speak, of the Pythagorean conception and the use of the equilateral triangle, and calls it a misnomer. His argument that a solid equilateral body, one whose base, as well as each of its sides, form equal triangles, must have 4 co-equal sides or surfaces, while a triangular plane will as necessarily possess 5, demonstrates on the contrary the grandeur of the conception and all its esoteric application to the idea of the pregenesis and the genesis of cosmos. Granted that an ideal triangle, depicted by mathematical imaginary lines, can have no sides at all, being simply a phantom of the mind to which, if sides be imputed, these must be the sides of the object it constructively represents. But in such case, most of the scientific hypotheses are no better than phantoms of the mind. They are unverifiable, except on inference, and have been adopted merely to answer scientific necessities. Furthermore, the ideal triangle as the abstract idea of a triangular body, and, therefore, as the type of an abstract idea accomplished and carried out to perfection, the double symbolism intended. As an emblem applicable to the objective idea, the simple triangle became a solid. When repeated in stone, facing the four cardinal points, it assumed the shape of the pyramid, the symbol of the phenomenal merging into the nominal universe of thought, at the apex of the four triangles, and, as an imaginary figure constructed of three mathematical lines, it symbolized the subjective spheres, these lines enclosing a mathematical space which is equal to nothing enclosing nothing. And this because, to the senses and the untrained consciousness of the profane and the scientist, everything beyond the line of differentiated matter, i.e., outside of and beyond the realm of even the most spiritual substance, has to remain forever equal to nothing. It is the Ein Sof, the no thing. Yet these phantoms of the mind are in truth no greater abstractions than the abstract ideas in general, as to evolution and physical development, e.g., gravity, matter, force, on which the exact sciences are based. Our most eminent chemists and physicists are earnestly pursuing the not hopeless attempt of finally tracing to its hiding place the profile, or the basic line of the Pythagorean triangle. The latter is, as we have said, the grandest conception imaginable, for it symbolizes both the ideal and the visible universes. For if the possible unit is only a possibility as an actuality of nature, as an individual of any kind, and as every individual natural object is capable of division, and by division loses its unity, or ceases to be a unit, this is true only of the realm of exact science in a world as deceptive as it is elusive. In the realm of esoteric science, the unit divided ad infinitum, instead of losing its unity, approaches with every division the planes of the only eternal reality. The eye of the seer can follow it and behold it in all its pregenetic glory. This same idea of the reality of the subjective and the unreality of the objective universe is found at the bottom of the Pythagorean and Platonic teachings limited to the elect alone, for Porphyry, speaking of the monad and the duad, says that the former only was considered substantial and real, that most simple being, the cause of all unity and the measure of all things. But the duad, although the origin of evil, or matter hence unreal in philosophy, is still substance during Manvantara, and is often called the third monad in occultism, and the connecting line as between 2 points, or numbers, which proceeded from that which was before all numbers as expressed by Rabbi Barahiel. And from this duad proceeded all the scintillas of the 3 upper and the 4 lower worlds or planes, which are in constant interaction and correspondence. This is a teaching which the Kabbalah has in common with Eastern occultism. For in the occult philosophy there is the one cause and the primal cause, the latter thus becoming, paradoxically, the second, as is clearly expressed by the author of the Kabbalah, from the philosophical writings of Ibn Gabriel, who says, "In the treatment of the primal cause, 2 things must be considered, the primal cause per se, and the relation and connection of the primal cause with the visible and unseen universe." Thus he shows the early Hebrews, as the later Arabians, following in the steps of the Oriental philosophy, such as the Chaldean, Persian, Hindu, etc. Their primal cause was designated at first by the triadic Shaddai, the triune Almighty, subsequently by the Tetragrammaton, YHVH symbol of the past, present, and future, and, let us add, of the eternal is, or the I Am. Moreover, in the Kabbalah the name YHVH, or Jehovah, expresses a he and a she, male and female, two in one, or Chakma and Binah, and his, or rather their Shekinah or synthesizing spirit, or grace, which again makes of the duet a triad. This is demonstrated in the Jewish liturgy for Pentecost and the prayer. In the name of unity, of the holy and blessed Hu He, and his Shekinah, the hidden and concealed Hu, blessed be YHVH the quaternary forever. Hu is said to be masculine and Yah feminine, together they make the I, one YHVH. One, but of a male-female nature. The Shekinah is always considered in the Kabbalah as feminine. And so it is considered in the Esoteric Puranas, for Shekinah is no more than Shakti, the female double of any god in such case. And so it was with the early Christians, whose Holy Spirit was feminine, as Sophia was with the Gnostics. But in the Transcendental Chaldean Kabbalah, or Book of Numbers, Shekinah is sexless, and the purest abstraction, a state, like nirvana, neither subject nor object, nor anything except an absolute presence. Thus it is only in the anthropomorphized systems such as the Kabbalah has now for the most part become that Shekinah Shakti is feminine. As such she becomes the duet of Pythagoras, the two straight lines which can form no geometrical figure, and are the symbol of matter. Out of this duet, when united in the basic line of the triangle on the lower plane, the upper triangle of the Sephirithal tree, emerge the Elohim, or deity in cosmic nature, with the true Kabbalists the lowest designation, translated in the Bible God. Out of these, the Elohim, issue the scintillas. The scintillas are the souls, and these souls appear in the threefold form of monads, units, atoms and gods according to our teaching. As says the Esoteric Catechism, every atom becomes a visible complex unit, a molecule, and once attracted into the sphere of terrestrial activity, the monadic essence, passing through the mineral, vegetable, and animal kingdoms, becomes man. Again, God, monad, and atom are the correspondences of spirit, mind, and body, atma, manas, and sthula sharira in man. In their septenary aggregation they are the heavenly man in the Kabbalistic sense. Thus, terrestrial man is the provisional reflection of the heavenly. Once again, the monads jivas are the souls of the atoms. Both are the fabric in which the Chohans Dionys, gods, clothe themselves when a form is needed. This relates to cosmic and subplanetary monads, not to the supercosmic monads, the Pythagorean monad, as it is called, in its synthetic character, by the pantheistical peripatetics. The monads of the present dissertation are treated, from the standpoint of their individuality, as atomic souls, before these atoms descend into pure terrestrial form. For this descent into concrete matter marks the medial point of their own individual pilgrimage. Here, losing in the mineral kingdom their individuality, they begin to ascend through the 7 states of terrestrial evolution to that point, where a correspondence is firmly established between the human and diva, divine, consciousness. At present, however, we are not concerned with their terrestrial metamorphoses and tribulations, but with their life and behavior in space, on planes wherein the eye of the most intuitional chemist and physicist cannot reach them unless, indeed, he develops in himself highly clairvoyant faculties. It is well known that Leibniz came very near the truth several times, but he defined monadic evolution incorrectly, a thing not to be wondered at, since he was not an initiate, nor even a mystic, but only a very intuitional philosopher. Yet no psychophysicist ever came nearer than has he to the esoteric general outline of evolution. This evolution viewed from its several standpoints, i.e., as the universal in the individualized monad, and the chief aspects of the evolving energy after differentiation, the purely spiritual, the intellectual, the psychic and the physical may be thus formulated as an invariable law. A descent of spirit into matter, equivalent to an ascent in physical evolution, a reascent from the depths of materiality towards its status quo ante, with a corresponding dissipation of concrete form and substance up to the laya state, or what science calls the 0 point and beyond. These states, once the spirit of esoteric philosophy is grasped, become absolutely necessary from simple logical and analogical considerations. Physical science having now ascertained, through its department of chemistry, the invariable law of this evolution of atoms from their protolan state down to that of a physical and then a chemical particle or molecule, cannot well reject these states as a general law. And once it is forced by its enemies metaphysics and psychology out of its alleged impregnable strongholds, it will find it more difficult than it now appears to refuse room in the spaces of space to planetary spirits, gods, elementals, and even the elementary spooks or ghosts, and others. Already Figure and Paul Dacier, two positivists and materialists, have succumbed before this logical necessity. Other and still greater scientists will follow in that intellectual fall. They will be driven out of their position not by spiritual, theosophical, or any other physical or even mental phenomena, but simply by the enormous gaps and chasms that open daily, and will still be opening before them, as one discovery follows the other, until they are finally knocked off their feet by the ninth wave of simple common sense. We may take as an example Mr. W. Crook's latest discovery of what he has named protyle. In the notes on the Bhagavad Gita, by one of the best metaphysicians and Vedantic scholars in India, the lecturer, referring cautiously to things occult in that great Indian esoteric work, makes a remark as suggestive as it is strictly correct. He says, "Into the details of the evolution of the solar system itself, it is not necessary for me to enter. You may gather some idea as to the way in which the various elements start into existence from these three principles into which Mulaprakriti, the Pythagorean triangle, is differentiated, by examining the lecture delivered by Professor Crookes a short time ago upon the so-called elements of modern chemistry. This lecture will give you some idea of the way in which these so-called elements spring from Vishvanara, the most objective of these three principles, which seems to stand in the place of the protyle mentioned in that lecture. Except in a few particulars, this lecture seems to give the outlines of the theory of physical evolution on the plane of Vishvanara, and is, so far as I know, the nearest approach made by modern investigators to the real occult theory on the subject." These words will be re-echoed and approved by every Eastern occultist. Much from the lectures by Mr. Crookes has already been quoted. A second lecture has been delivered by him, as remarkable as the first, on the genesis of the elements, and also a third one. Here we have almost a corroboration of the teachings of esoteric philosophy concerning the mode of primeval evolution. It is, indeed, as near an approach, made by a great scholar and specialist in chemistry 1072 to the secret doctrine, as could be made apart from the application of the monads and atoms to the dogmas of pure transcendental metaphysics, and their connection and correlation with gods and intelligent conscious monads. But chemistry is now on its ascending plane, thanks to one of its highest European representatives. It is impossible for it to go back to that day when materialism regarded its sub-elements as absolutely simple and homogeneous bodies, which it had raised, in its blindness, to the rank of elements. The mask has been snatched off by too clever a hand for there to be any fear of a new disguise. And after years of pseudology, of bastard molecules parading under the name of elements, behind and beyond which there could be naught but void, a great professor of chemistry asks once more, what are these elements? Whence do they come? What is their signification? These elements perplex us in our researches, baffle us in our speculations, and haunt us in our very dreams. They stretch like an unknown sea before us, mocking, mystifying, and murmuring strange revelations and possibilities. Those who are heirs to primeval revelations have taught these possibilities in every century, but have never found a fair hearing. The truths inspired into Kepler, Leibniz, Gassendi, Swedenborg were ever alloyed with their own speculations in one or another predetermined direction, hence were distorted. But now one of the great truths has dawned upon an eminent professor of exact modern science, and he fearlessly proclaims as a fundamental axiom that science has not made itself acquainted, so far, with real simple elements. For Mr. Crookes tells his audience, if I venture to say that our commonly received elements are not simple and primordial, that they have not arisen by chance or have not been created in a desultory and mechanical manner, but have been evolved from simpler matters or perhaps, indeed, from one sole kind of matter, I do but give formal utterance to an idea which has been, so to speak, for some time in the air of science. Chemists, physicists, philosophers of the highest merit declare explicitly their belief that the 70, or thereabouts, elements of our textbooks are not the pillars of Hercules, which we must never hope to pass. Philosophers in the present as in the past, men who certainly have not worked in the laboratory, have reached the same view from another side. Thus Mr. Herbert Spencer records his conviction that the chemical atoms are produced from the true or physical atoms by processes of evolution under conditions which chemistry has not yet been able to produce. And the poet has forestalled the philosopher. Milton makes the archangel Raphael say to Adam instinct with the evolutionary idea that the Almighty had created one first matter, all endued with various forms, various degrees of substance. Nevertheless, the idea would have remained crystallized in the air of science and would not have descended into the thick atmosphere of materialism and profane mortals for years to come, perhaps, had not Mr. Crookes bravely and fearlessly reduced it to its simple constituents and thus publicly forced it on scientific notice. Says Plutarch, an idea is a being incorporeal, which has no subsistence by itself, but gives figure and form unto shapeless matter, and becomes the cause of the manifestation. The revolution produced in old chemistry by Avogadro was the first page in the volume of New Chemistry. Mr. Crookes has now turned the second page and is boldly pointing to what may be the last. For Protyle once accepted and recognized as invisible ether was, both being logical and scientific necessities, chemistry will have virtually ceased to live. It will reappear in its reincarnation as new alchemy or metachemistry. The discoverer of radiant matter will have vindicated in time the archaic Aryan works on occultism, and even the Vedas and Puranas. For what are the manifested mother, the father, Sonhusband, Aditi and Daksha, a form of Brahma, as creators, and the Sun the three firstborn but simply hydrogen, oxygen, and that which in its terrestrial manifestation is called nitrogen. Even the exoteric descriptions of the firstborn triad give all the characteristics of these three gases. Priestley, the discoverer of oxygen, or of that which was known in the highest antiquity. Yet all the ancient, medieval, and modern poets and philosophers have been anticipated even in the exoteric Hindu books as to the elemental vortices inaugurated by the universal mind. Descartes' plenum of matter differentiated into particles, Leibniz's ethereal fluid, and Kant's primitive fluid dissolved into its elements, Kepler's solar vortex and systemic vortices, in short, through Anaxagoras, down to Galileo, Torricelli, and Swedenborg, and after them to the latest speculations by European mystics. All this is found in the Hindu hymns, or mantras, to the gods, monads and atoms in their fullness, for they are inseparable. In esoteric teachings, the most transcendental conceptions of the universe and its mysteries, as also the most seemingly materialistic speculations, are found reconciled, because these sciences embrace the whole scope of evolution from spirit to matter. As declared by an American theosophist, the monads of Leibniz may from one point of view be called force, from another matter. To occult science, force and matter are only two sides of the same substance. Let the reader remember these monads of Leibniz, every one of which is a living mirror of the universe, every monad reflecting every other, and compare this view and definition with certain Sanskrit shlokas translated by Sir William Jones, in which it is said that the creative source of the divine mind, hidden in a veil of thick darkness, formed mirrors of the atoms of the world, and cast reflection from its own face on every atom. When, therefore, Mr. Crookes declares that if we can show how the so-called chemical elements might have been generated, we shall be able to fill up a formidable gap in our knowledge of the universe, the answer is ready. The theoretical knowledge is contained in the esoteric meaning of every Hindu cosmogony in the Puranas. The practical demonstration thereof is in the hands of those who will not be recognized in this century, save by the very few. The scientific possibilities of various discoveries that must inexorably lead exact science into the acceptation of Eastern occult views, which contain all the requisite material for the filling of those gaps, are, so far, at the mercy of modern materialism. It is only by working in the direction taken by Mr. William Crookes that there is any hope for the recognition of a few, hitherto occult, truths. Meanwhile, anyone thirsting to have a glimpse at a practical diagram of the evolution of primordial matter which, separating and differentiating under the impulse of cyclic law, divides itself on a general view into a septenary gradation of substance can do no better than examine the plates attached to Mr. Crookes' lecture, Genesis of the Elements, and ponder well over some passages of the text. In one place he says, "Our notions of a chemical element have expanded. Hitherto the molecule has been regarded as an aggregate of two or more atoms, and no account has been taken of the architectural design on which these atoms have been joined. We may consider that the structure of a chemical element is more complicated than has hitherto been supposed. Between the molecules we are accustomed to deal with in chemical reactions and ultimate atoms as first created, come smaller molecules or aggregates of physical atoms. These sub-molecules differ one from the other, according to the position they occupy in the yttrium edifice. Perhaps this hypothesis can be simplified if we imagine yttrium to be represented by a 5-shilling piece. By chemical fractionation I have divided it into 5 separate shillings, and find that these shillings are not counterparts, but like the carbon atoms in the benzyl ring, have the impress of their position 1, 2, 3, 4, 5 stamped on them. If I throw my shillings into the melting pot or dissolve them chemically, the mint stamp disappears and they all turn out to be silver. This will be the case with all the atoms and molecules when they have separated from their compound forms and bodies when pralaya sets in. Reverse the case and imagine the dawn of a new manvantara. The pure silver of the absorbed material will once more separate into substance, which will generate divine essences whose principles are the primary elements, the sub-elements, the physical energies, and subjective and objective matter, or, as these are epitomized, gods, monads, and atoms. If leaving for one moment the metaphysical or transcendental side of the question, dropping out of the present consideration, the supersensuous and intelligent beings and entities believed in by the Kabbalists and Christians, we turn to the theory of atomic evolution. The occult teachings are still found corroborated by exact science and its confessions, so far, at least, as regards the supposed simple elements. Now suddenly degraded into poor and distant relatives, not even second cousins to the latter. For we are told by Mr. Crookes that, hitherto, it has been considered that if the atomic weight of a metal, determined by different observers, setting out from different compounds, was always found to be constant, then such metal must rightly take rank among the simpler elementary bodies. We learn that this is no longer the case. Again, we have here wheels within wheels. Gadolinium is not an element but a compound. We have shown that yttrium is a complex of 5 or more new constituents. And who shall venture to gainsay that each of these constituents, if attacked in some different manner, and if the result were submitted to a test more delicate and searching than the radiant matter test, might not be still further divisible? Where, then, is the actual ultimate element? As we advance, it recedes like the tantalizing mirage lakes and groves seen by the tired and thirsty traveler in the desert. Are we in our quest for truth to be thus diluted and bulked? The very idea of an element, as something absolutely primary and ultimate, seems to be growing less and less distinct. An Isis unveiled, we said. This mystery of first creation, which was ever the despair of science, is unfathomable unless we accept the doctrine of Hermes. Could Darwin remove his quest from the visible universe into the invisible, he might find himself on the right path. But then, he would be following in the footsteps of the Hermetists. Our prophecy begins to assert itself. But between Hermes and Huxley there is a middle course and point. Let the men of science only throw a bridge halfway and think seriously over the theories of Leibniz. We have shown our theories with regard to the evolution of atoms, their last formation into compound chemical molecules being produced within our terrestrial workshops in the Earth's atmosphere, and not elsewhere, as strangely agreeing with the evolution of atoms shown on Mr. Crookes' plates. Several times already it has been stated in this volume that Martanda, the sun, had evolved and aggregated, together with his 7 smaller brothers, from his mother Aditi's bosom, that bosom being prima materia of the lecturer's primordial protyle. Esoteric doctrines teach the existence of an antecedent form of energy, having periodic cycles of ebb and swell, rest and activity. And behold a great scholar in science now asking the world to accept this as one of his postulates. We have shown the mother fiery and hot, becoming gradually cool and radiant, And this same scientist claims as his second postulate a scientific necessity. It would seem an internal action, akin to cooling, operating slowly in the protyle. Occult science teaches that the mother lies stretched in infinity, during pralaya, as the great deep, the dry waters of space, according to the quaint expression in the Catechism, and becomes wet only after the separation and the moving over its face of Narayana, the spirit which is invisible flame, which never burns, but sets on fire all that it touches, and gives it life and generation. And now science tells us that the first-born element most nearly allied to protyle would be hydrogen, which for some time would be the only existing form of matter in the universe. What says old science? It answers, just so, but we would call hydrogen and oxygen, which in the pre-geological and even pre-genetic ages instills the fire of life into the mother by incubation, the spirit, the noumenon, of that which becomes in its grossest form oxygen and hydrogen, and nitrogen on earth, nitrogen, being of no divine origin, but merely an earth-born cement for uniting other gases and fluids, and serving as a sponge to carry in itself the breath of life, pure air. Before these gases and fluids become what they are in our atmosphere, they are interstellar ether, still earlier and on a deeper plane something else, and so on in infinitum. The eminent and learned gentleman must pardon an occultist for quoting him at such length, but such is the penalty of a fellow of the Royal Society who approaches so near the precincts of the sacred adytum of occult mysteries as virtually to overstep the forbidden boundaries. But it is time to leave modern physical science and turn to the psychological and metaphysical side of the question. We would only remark that to the two very reasonable postulates required by the eminent lecturer to get a glimpse of some few of the secrets so darkly hidden behind the door of the unknown, a third should be added lest no battering at it should avail: the postulate that Leibniz stood on a firm groundwork of fact and truth in his speculations. The admirable and thoughtful synopsis of these speculations as given by John Theodor Mertz in his Leibniz shows how nearly he has brushed the hidden secrets of esoteric theogony in his monadology. And yet this philosopher has hardly risen in his speculations above the first planes, the lower principles of the cosmic great body. His theory soars to no loftier heights than those of the manifested life, self-consciousness and intelligence, leaving the regions of the earlier post-genetic mysteries untouched, as his ethereal fluid is post-planetary. But this third postulate will hardly be accepted by the modern men of science, and, like Descartes, they will prefer keeping to the properties of external things, which, like extension, are incapable of explaining the phenomenon of motion, rather than accept the latter as an independent force. They will never become anti-Cartesian in this generation, nor will they admit that this property of inertia is not a purely geometrical property, that it points to the existence of something in external bodies, which is not extension merely. This is Leibniz's idea as analyzed by Mertz, who adds that he called this something force, and maintained that external things were endowed with force, and that in order to be the bearers of this force, they must have a substance, for they are not lifeless and inert masses, but the centers and bearers of form, a purely esoteric claim. Since force was with Leibniz an active principle, the division between mind and matter disappearing by this conclusion, the mathematical and dynamical enquiries of Leibniz would not have led to the same result in the mind of a purely scientific inquirer. But Leibniz was not a scientific man in the modern sense of the word. Had he been so, he might have worked out the conception of energy, defined mathematically the ideas of force and mechanical work, and arrived at the conclusion that even for purely scientific purposes, it is desirable to look upon force not as a primary quantity, but as a quantity derived from some other value. But, luckily for truth, Leibniz was a philosopher, and as such he had certain primary principles, which biased him in favor of certain conclusions, and his discovery that external things were substances endowed with force was at once used for the purpose of applying these principles. One of these principles was the law of continuity, the conviction that all the world was connected, that there were no gaps and chasms which could not be bridged over. The contrast of extended thinking substances was unbearable to him. The definition of the extended substances had already become untenable. It was natural that a similar enquiry was made into the definition of mind, the thinking substance. The divisions made by Leibniz, however incomplete and faulty from the standpoint of occultism, show a spirit of metaphysical intuition, to which no man of science, not Descartes, not even Kant, has ever reached. With him there existed ever an infinite gradation of thought. Only a small portion of the contents of our thoughts, he said, rises into the clearness of apperception, into the light of perfect consciousness. Many remain in a confused or obscure state, in the state of perceptions, but they are there. Descartes denied soul to the animal. Leibniz, as do the occultists, endowed the whole creation with mental life, thus being, according to him, capable of infinite gradations. And this, as Merz justly observes, at once widened the realm of mental life, destroying the contrast of animate and inanimate matter. It did yet more it reacted on the conception of matter, of the extended substance. For it became evident that external or material things presented the property of extension to our senses only, not to our thinking faculties. The mathematician, in order to calculate geometrical figures, had been obliged to divide them into an infinite number of infinitely small parts, and the physicist saw no limit to the divisibility of matter into atoms. The bulk through which external things seemed to fill space was a property which they acquired only through the coarseness of our senses. Leibniz followed these arguments to some extent, but he could not rest content in assuming that matter was composed of a finite number of very small parts. His mathematical mind forced him to carry out the argument in infinitum. And what became of the atoms then? They lost their extension, and they retained only their property of resistance. They were the centers of force. They were reduced to mathematical points. But if their extension in space was nothing, so much fuller was their inner life. Assuming that inner existence, such as that of the human mind, is a new dimension, not a geometrical but a metaphysical dimension, having reduced the geometrical extension of the atoms to nothing, Leibniz endowed them with an infinite extension in the direction of their metaphysical dimension. After having lost sight of them in the world of space, the mind has, as it were, to dive into a metaphysical world to find and grasp the real essence of what appears in space merely as a mathematical point. As a cone stands on its point, or a perpendicular straight line cuts a horizontal plane only in one mathematical point, but may extend infinitely in height and depth, so the essences of things real have only a punctual existence in this physical world of space, but have an infinite depth of inner life in the metaphysical world of thought. This is the spirit, the very root of occult doctrine and thought. The spirit matter and matter spirit extend infinitely in depth, And like the essence of things of Leibniz, our essence of things real is at the seventh depth, while the unreal and gross matter of science and the external world is at the lowest extreme of our perceptive senses. The occultist knows the worth or worthlessness of the latter. The student must now be shown the fundamental distinction between the system of Leibniz and that of occult philosophy on the question of the monads, and this may be done with his monadology before us. It may be correctly stated that were Leibniz and Spinoza's systems reconciled, the essence and spirit of esoteric philosophy would be made to appear. From the shock of the two as opposed to the Cartesian system emerged the truths of the archaic doctrine. Both oppose the metaphysics of Descartes. His idea of the contrast of two substances, extension and thought radically differing from each other and mutually irreducible, is too arbitrary and too unphilosophical for them. Thus Leibniz made of the two Cartesian substances two attributes of one universal unity, in which he saw God. Spinoza recognized but one universal indivisible substance, an absolute all, like Parabrahman. Leibniz, on the contrary, perceived the existence of a plurality of substances. There was but one for Spinoza, for Leibniz an infinitude of beings, from, and in, the one. Hence, though both admitted but one real entity, while Spinoza made it impersonal and indivisible, Leibniz divided his personal deity into a number of divine and semi-divine beings. Spinoza was a subjective, Leibniz an objective pantheist, yet both were great philosophers in their intuitive perceptions. Now, if these two teachings were blended together and each corrected by the other and foremost of all the one reality weeded of its personality, there would remain as sum total a true spirit of esoteric philosophy in them, the impersonal, attributeless, absolute divine essence, which is no being, but the root of all being. Draw a deep line in your thought between that ever-incognizable essence and the as invisible, yet comprehensible presence, Mulaprakriti or Shekinah, from beyond and through which vibrates the sound of the verbum, and from which evolved the numberless hierarchies of intelligent egos, of conscious as of semi-conscious, apperceptive and perceptive beings, whose essence is spiritual force, whose substance is the elements, and whose bodies, when needed, are the atoms, and our doctrine is there. For, says Leibniz, the primitive element of every material body being force, which has none of the characteristics of objective matter, it can be conceived, but can never be the object of any imaginative representation. That which was for him the primordial and ultimate element in everybody and object was thus not the material atoms or molecules, necessarily more or less extended, as those of Epicurus and Gassendi, but, as Merz shows, immaterial and metaphysical atoms, mathematical points or real souls, as explained by Henry Lachlier, professeur agrégé de philosophie, his French biographer. That which exists outside of us in an absolute manner are souls whose essence is force. Thus, reality in the manifested world is composed of a unity of units, so to say, immaterial from our standpoint and infinite. These Leibniz calls monads, Eastern philosophy jivas, while occultism, with the Kabbalists and all the Christians, gives them a variety of names. With us, as with Leibniz, they are the expression of the universe, and every physical point is but the phenomenal expression of the nominal, metaphysical point. His distinction between perception and apperception is the philosophical though dim expression of the esoteric teachings. His reduced universes, of which there are as many as there are monads, is the chaotic representation of our septenary system, with its divisions and subdivisions. As to the relation his monads bear to Ardayan Chohans, cosmic spirits, devas, and elementals, we may reproduce briefly the opinion of a learned and thoughtful theosophist, Mr. Bjerregaard, on the subject. In an excellent paper on the elementals, the elementary spirits, and the relationship between them and human beings read by him before the Aryan Theosophical Society of New York, Mr. Bjerregaard thus distinctly formulates his opinion. To Spinoza, substance is dead and inactive, but to Leibniz's penetrating powers of mind everything is living activity and active energy. In holding this view, he comes infinitely nearer the Orient than any other thinker of his day, or after him. His discovery that an active energy forms the essence of substance is a principle that places him in direct relationship to the seers of the East. And the lecturer proceeds to show that to Leibniz atoms and elements are centers of force, or rather spiritual beings, whose very nature it is to act, for the elementary particles are vital forces, not acting mechanically, but from an internal principle. They are incorporeal spiritual units, substantial however, but not immaterial in our sense, inaccessible to all change from without and indestructible by any external force. Leibniz monads differ from atoms in the following particulars, which are very important for us to remember, otherwise we shall not be able to see the difference between elementals and mere matter. Atoms are not distinguished from each other, they are qualitatively alike, but one monad differs from every other monad qualitatively, and every one is a peculiar world to itself. Not so with the atoms, they are absolutely alike quantitatively and qualitatively, and possess no individuality of their own. Again, the atom's molecules, rather of materialistic philosophy, can be considered as extended and divisible, while the monads are mere metaphysical points and indivisible. Finally, and this is a point where these monads of Leibniz closely resemble the elementals of mystic philosophy, these monads are representative beings. Every monad reflects every other. Every monad is a living mirror of the universe within its own sphere. And mark this, for upon it depends the power possessed by these monads, and upon it depends the work they can do for us. In mirroring the world, the monads are not mere passive reflective agents, but spontaneously self-active. They produce the images spontaneously, as the soul does a dream. In every monad, therefore, the adept married everything, even the future. Every monad or elemental is a looking glass that can speak. It is at this point that Leibniz's philosophy breaks down. There is no provision made, nor any distinction established, between the elemental monad and that of a high planetary spirit, or even the human monad or soul. He even goes so far as to sometimes doubt whether God has ever made anything but monads or substances without extension. He draws a distinction between monads and atoms because, as he repeatedly states, bodies with all their qualities are only phenomenal, like the rainbow. Corpora omnia cum omnibus qualitatibus suis non sunt aliud quam phenomena being fundata, ut iris. But soon after he finds a provision for this in a substantial correspondence, a certain metaphysical bond between the monads vinculum substantiale. Esoteric philosophy, teaching an objective idealism though it regards the objective universe and all in it as Maya, temporary illusion, draws a practical distinction between collective illusion, Mahamaya, from the purely metaphysical standpoint, and the objective relations in it between various conscious egos, so long as this illusion lasts. The adept, therefore, may read the future in an elemental monad, but he has to draw together for this object a great number of them, as each monad represents only a portion of the kingdom it belongs to. It is not in the object, but in the modification of the cognition of the object that the monads are limited. They all tend, confusedly, to the infinite, to the whole, but they are limited and distinguished by the degrees of distinctness in their perception. And as Leibniz explains, all the portions of the universe are distinctly represented in the monads, but some are reflected in one monad, some in another. A number of monads could represent simultaneously the thoughts of the 2 million inhabitants of Paris. But what say the occult sciences to this, and what do they add? They say that what is called collectively monads by Leibniz, roughly viewed, and leaving every subdivision out of calculation, for the present may be separated into 3 distinct hosts, which, counted from the highest planes, are, firstly, gods or conscious spiritual egos, the intelligent architects, who work after the plan and the divine mind. Then come the elementals, or monads, who form collectively and unconsciously the grand universal mirrors of everything connected with their respective realms. Lastly, the atoms or material molecules, which are informed in their turn by their perceptive monads, just as every cell in a human body is so informed. There are shoals of such informed atoms which, in their turn, inform the molecules, an infinitude of monads, or elementals proper, and countless spiritual forces monadless, for they are pure incorporealities, except under certain laws, when they assume a form not necessarily human. Whence the substance that clothes them, the apparent organism they evolve around their centers? The formless, arupa, radiations, existing in the harmony of universal will, and being what we term the collective or the aggregate of cosmic will on the plane of the subjective universe, unite together an infinitude of monads, each the mirror of its own universe, and thus individualize for the time being an independent mind. Omniscient and universal, and by the same process of magnetic aggregation they create for themselves objective, visible bodies out of the interstellar atoms. For atoms and monads, associated or dissociated, simple or complex, are, from the moment of the first differentiation, but the principles corporeal, psychic and spiritual, of the gods themselves, the radiations of primordial nature. Thus, to the eye of the seer, the higher planetary powers appear under 2 aspects: the subjective as influences, and the objective as mystic forms, which, under karmic law, become a presence, spirit and matter being one, as repeatedly stated. Spirit is matter on the 7th plane, matter is spirit at the lowest point of its cyclic activity, and both are Maya. Atoms are called vibrations in occultism, also sound collectively. This does not interfere with Mr. Tyndall's scientific discovery. He traced, on the lower rung of the ladder of monadic being, the whole course of the atmospheric vibrations, and this constitutes the objective part of the process in nature. He has traced and recorded the rapidity of their motion and transmission, the force of their impact, their setting up vibrations in the tympanum, and their transmission of these to the otoliths, etc. Till the vibration of the auditory nerve commences and a new phenomenon now takes place. The subjective sight of the process, or the sensation of sound. Does he perceive or see it? No, for his specialty is to discover the behavior of matter. But why should not a psychic see it, a spiritual seer, whose inner eye is opened, one who can see through the veil of matter? The waves and undulations of science are all produced by atoms propelling their molecules into activity from within. Atoms fill the immensity of space, and by their continuous vibration, are that motion which keeps the wheels of life perpetually going. It is that inner work that produces the natural phenomenon called the correlation of forces. Only, at the origin of every such force there stands the conscious guiding noumenon thereof, angel or god, spirit or demon, ruling powers, yet the same. As described by seers, those who can see the motion of the interstellar shoals and follow them clairvoyantly in their evolution, they are dazzling, like specks of virgin snow in radiant sunlight. Their velocity is swifter than thought, quicker than any mortal physical eye can follow, and, as well as can be judged from the tremendous rapidity of their course, the motion is circular. Standing on an open plain, on a mountain summit especially, and gazing into the vast vault above and the spatial infinitudes around, the whole atmosphere seems ablaze with them, the air soaked through with these dazzling coruscations. At times, the intensity of their motion produces flashes like the northern lights in the aurora borealis. The sight is so marvelous that, as the seer gazes into this inner world and feels the scintillating points shoot past him, he is filled with awe at the thought of other, still greater mysteries that lie beyond and within this radiant ocean. However imperfect and incomplete this explanation on gods, monads and atoms, it is hoped that some students and theosophists, at least, will feel that there may indeed be a close relation between materialistic science and occultism, which is the complement and missing soul of the former. Cyclic Evolution and Karma. It is the spiritual evolution of the inner, immortal man that forms the fundamental tenet of the occult sciences. To realize even distantly such a process, the student has to believe A. in the one universal life, independent of matter, or what science regards as matter, and B. in the individual intelligences that animate the various manifestations of this principle. Mr. Huxley does not believe in vital force, other scientists do. Dr. J. H. Hutchinson Sterling's work as regards protoplasm has made no small havoc of this dogmatic negation. Professor Beale's decision also is in favor of a vital principle, and Dr. B. W. Richardson's lectures on nervous ether have been sufficiently quoted. Thus, opinions are divided. The one life is closely related to the one law, which governs the world of being, karma. Exoterically, this is simply and literally action, or rather an effect-producing cause. Esoterically, it is quite a different thing in its far-reaching moral effects. It is the unerring law of retribution. To say to those ignorant of the real significance, characteristics, and awful importance of this eternal immutable law, that no theological definition of a personal deity can give an idea of this impersonal, yet ever-present and active principle, is to speak in vain. Nor can it be called providence. For providence, with the theists, the Protestant Christians, at any rate, rejoices in a personal male gender, while with the Roman Catholics it is a female potency. Divine providence tempers his blessings to secure their better effects, Wogan tells us. Indeed, he tempers them, which karma, a sexless principle, does not. Throughout the first two parts, it has been shown that, at the first flutter of renascent life, Svabhavat, the mutable radiance of the immutable darkness unconscious in eternity, passes, at every new rebirth of cosmos, from an inactive state into one of intense activity, that it differentiates, and then begins its work through that differentiation. This work is karma. The cycles are also subservient to the effects produced by this activity. The one cosmic atom becomes 7 atoms on the plane of matter, and each is transformed into a center of energy. That same atom becomes 7 rays on the plane of spirit, and the 7 creative forces of nature, radiating from the root essence follow, one the right, the other the left path, separate till the end of the kalpa, and yet in close embrace. What unites them? Karma. The atoms emanated from the central point emanate in their turn new centers of energy, which, under the potential breath of Fohit, begin their work from within without, and multiply other minor centers. These, in the course of evolution and involution, form in their turn the roots or developing causes of new effects, from worlds and man-bearing globes, down to the genera, species, and classes of all the 7 kingdoms, of which we know only 4. For as says the Book of the Aphorisms of Tsongkhapa, the blessed workers have received the Thyan Kam in the eternity. Thyan Kam is the power or knowledge of guiding the impulses of cosmic energy in the right direction. The true Buddhist, recognizing no personal God nor any father and creator of heaven and earth, still believes in an absolute consciousness, Adi-Buddhi, and the Buddhist philosopher knows that there are planetary spirits, the Dayan Chohans. But though he admits of spiritual lives yet, as they are temporary in eternity, even they, according to his philosophy, are the Maya of the day, the illusion of a day of Brahma, a short manvantara of 4,320,000,000 years. The yin-sin is not for the speculations of men, for the Lord Buddha has strongly prohibited all such enquiry. If the Dayan Chohans and all the invisible beings, the 7 centers and their direct emanations, the minor centers of energy are the direct reflex of the one light, yet men are far removed from these, since the whole of the visible cosmos consists of self-produced beings, the creatures of karma. Thus regarding a personal God as only a gigantic shadow thrown upon the void of space by the imagination of ignorant men, they teach that only 2 things are objectively eternal, namely Akasha and Nirvana, and that these are one in reality, and but a maya when divided. Everything has come out of Akasha or Svabhavat on our earth in obedience to a law of motion inherent in it, and after a certain existence passes away. No thing ever came out of nothing. We do not believe in miracles, hence we deny creation and cannot conceive of a creator. If a Vedantic Brahmin of the Advaita sect were asked whether he believed in the existence of God, he would probably answer, as Jacaliot was answered, I am myself God, while a Buddhist, a Sinhalese especially, would simply laugh and say in reply, there is no God, no creation. Yet the root philosophy of both Advaita and Buddhist scholars is identical, and both have the same respect for animal life, for both believe that every creature on earth, however small and humble, is an immortal portion of the immortal matter, having with them quite another significance from that which it has with either Christian or materialist, and that every creature is subject to karma. The answer of the Brahmin would have suggested itself to every ancient philosopher, Kabbalist, and Gnostic of the early days. It contains the very spirit of the Delphic and Kabbalistic commandments, for esoteric philosophy solved, ages ago, the problem of what man was, is, and will be, his origin, life cycle interminable in its duration of successive incarnations or rebirths, and his final absorption into the source from which he started. But it is not physical science that we can ever ask to read man for us, as the riddle of the past, or of the future, since no philosopher can tell us even what man is, as known to both physiology and psychology. In doubt whether man was a god or a beast, Science has now connected him with the latter and derives him from an animal. Certainly the task of analyzing and classifying the human being as a terrestrial animal may be left to science, which occultists, of all men, regard with veneration and respect. They recognize its ground and the wonderful work it has done, the progress achieved in physiology, and even to a degree in biology. But man's inner, spiritual, psychic, or even moral nature cannot be left to the tender mercies of an ingrained materialism, for not even the higher psychological philosophy of the West is able, in its present incompleteness and tendency towards a decided agnosticism, to do justice to the inner man, especially to his higher capacities and perceptions, and to those states of consciousness across the road to which such authorities as Mill draw a strong line, saying so far, and no farther shalt thou go. No occultist would deny that man, together with the elephant and the microbe, the crocodile and the lizard, the blade of grass and the crystal, is, in his physical formation, the simple product of the evolutionary forces of nature through a numberless series of transformations. But he puts the case differently. It is not against zoological and anthropological discoveries, based on the fossils of man and animal, that every mystic and believer in a divine soul inwardly revolts, but only against the uncalled for conclusions built on preconceived theories and made to fit in with certain prejudices. The premises of scientists may or may not be always true, and as some of these theories live but a short life, the deductions therefrom must ever be one-sided with materialistic evolutionists. Yet it is on the strength of such very ephemeral authority that most of the men of science frequently receive honors where they deserve them the least. To make the working of karma and the periodical renovations of the universe more evident and intelligible to the student when he arrives at the origin and evolution of man, he has now to examine with us the esoteric bearing of the karmic cycles upon universal ethics. The question is, do those mysterious divisions of time, called yugas and kalpas by the Hindus, and so very graphically, cycles, rings or circles, by the Greeks, have any bearing upon, or any direct connection with, human life? Even exoteric philosophy explains that these perpetual circles of time are ever returning on themselves, periodically and intelligently, in space and eternity. There are cycles of matter, and there are cycles of spiritual evolution and racial, national, and individual cycles. May not esoteric speculation allow us a still deeper insight into their workings? This idea is beautifully expressed in a very clever scientific work. The possibility of rising to a comprehension of a system of coordination so far outreaching in time and space all range of human observations is a circumstance which signalizes the power of man to transcend the limitations of changing and inconsistent matter and assert his superiority over all insentient and perishable forms of being. There is a method in the succession of events and in the relation of coexistent things, which the mind of man seizes hold of, and by means of this as a clue, he runs back or forward over eons of material history, of which human experience can never testify. Events germinate and unfold. They have a past which is connected with their present, and we feel a well-justified confidence that a future is appointed, which will be similarly connected with the present and the past. This continuity and unity of history repeat themselves before our eyes in all conceivable stages of progress. The phenomena furnish us the grounds for the generalization of two laws which are truly principles of scientific divination. by which alone the human mind penetrates the sealed records of the past and the unopened pages of the future. The first of these is the law of evolution, or, to phrase it for our purpose, the law of correlated successiveness or organized history in the individual, illustrated in the changing phases of every single maturing system of results. These thoughts summon into our immediate presence the measureless past and the measureless future of material history. They seem almost to open vistas through infinity and to endow the human intellect with an existence and a vision, exempt from the limitations of time and space and finite causation, and lift it up towards a sublime apprehension of the supreme intelligence whose dwelling place is eternity. According to the teachings, Maya, the elusive appearance of the marshalling of events and actions on this earth, changes, varying with nations and places. But the chief features of one's life are always in accordance with the constellation under which one is born, or, we should say, with the characteristics of its animating principle or the deity that presides over it, whether we call it a Dayan Chohan, as in Asia, or an archangel, as with the Greek and Latin churches. In ancient symbolism it was always the sun, though the spiritual, not the visible, sun was meant that was supposed to send forth the chief saviors and avatars. Hence the connecting link between the Buddhas, the avatars, and so many other incarnations of the highest seven. The closer the approach to one's prototype in heaven, the better for the mortal whose personality was chosen by his own personal deity, the seventh principle, as its terrestrial abode. 4. With every effort of will toward purification and unity with that self-God, one of the lower rays breaks, and the spiritual entity of man is drawn higher and ever higher to the ray that supersedes the first, until, from ray to ray, the inner man is drawn into the one and highest beam of the parent sun. Thus, the events of humanity do run coordinately with the number forms, since the single units of that humanity proceed one and all from the same source, the central sun and its shadow, the visible. For the equinoxes and solstices, the periods and various phases of the solar course, astronomically and numerically expressed, are only the concrete symbols of the eternally living verity, though they do seem abstract ideas to uninitiated mortals. And this explains the extraordinary numerical coincidences with geometrical relations shown by several authors. Yes, our destiny is written in the stars. Only, the closer the union between the mortal reflection man and his celestial prototype, the less dangerous the external conditions and subsequent reincarnations which neither Buddhas nor Christs can escape. This is not superstition, least of all is it fatalism. The latter implies a blind course of some still blinder power, but man is a free agent during his stay on earth. He cannot escape his ruling destiny, but he has the choice of two paths that lead him in that direction, and he can reach the goal of misery if such is decreed to him, either in the snowy white robes of the martyr, or in the soiled garments of a volunteer in the iniquitous course, for there are external and internal conditions which affect the determination of our will upon our actions, and it is in our power to follow either of the two. Those who believe in karma have to believe in destiny, which, from birth to death, every man weaves thread by thread round himself, as a spider his web, and this destiny is guided either by the heavenly voice of the invisible prototype outside of us, or by our more intimate astral, or inner man, who is but too often the evil genius of the embodied entity called man. Both these lead on the outward man, but one of them must prevail, and from the very beginning of the invisible affray, The stern and implacable law of compensation steps in and takes its course, faithfully following the fluctuations of the fight. When the last strand is woven, and man is seemingly enwrapped in the network of his own doing, then he finds himself completely under the empire of this self-made destiny. It then either fixes him like the inert shell against the immovable rock, or carries him away like a feather in a whirlwind raised by his own actions, and this is karma. A materialist, treating of the periodical creations of our globe, has expressed it in a single sentence. The whole past of the earth is nothing but an unfolded present. The writer was Buchner, who little suspected that he was repeating an axiom of the occultists. It is quite true also, as Burmeister remarks, that the historical investigation of the development of the earth has proved that now and then rest upon the same base, that the past has been developed in the same manner as the present rolls on, and that the forces which were in action ever remained the same. The forces their noumena rather are the same, of course, therefore, the phenomenal forces must be the same also. But how can anyone feel so sure that the attributes of matter have not altered under the hand of protean evolution? How can any materialist assert with such confidence, as is done by Massler, that this eternal conformity in the essence of phenomena renders it certain that fire and water possessed of all times the same powers, and ever will possess them? Who are they that darken counsel with words without knowledge, and where were the Huxleys and Buchners when the foundations of the earth were laid by the great law? This same homogeneity of matter and immutability of natural laws, which are so much insisted upon by materialism, are a fundamental principle of the occult philosophy, but this unity rests upon the inseparability of spirit from matter, and, if the two were once divorced, the whole cosmos would fall back into chaos and non-being. Therefore, it is absolutely false, and but an additional demonstration of the great conceit of our age, to assert, as men of science do, that all the great geological changes and terrible convulsions of the past have been produced by ordinary and known physical forces. For these forces were but the tools and final means for the accomplishment of certain purposes, acting periodically and apparently mechanically through an inward impulse mixed up with, but beyond their material nature. There is a purpose in every important act of nature, whose acts are all cyclic and periodical. But spiritual forces having been usually confused with the purely physical, the former are denied by, and therefore, because left unexamined, have to remain unknown to science. Says Hegel. The history of the world begins with its general aim, the realization of the idea of spirit only in an implicit form, and sich, that is, as nature, a hidden, most profoundly hidden unconscious instinct, and the whole process of history is directed to rendering this unconscious impulse a conscious one. Thus appearing in the form of merely natural existence, natural will, that which has been called the subjective side, physical craving, instinct, passion, private interest, as also opinion and subjective conception spontaneously present themselves at the very commencement. This vast congeries of volitions, interests and activities constitute the instruments and means of the world spirit for attaining its object, bringing it to consciousness and realizing it. And this aim is none other than finding itself, coming to itself and contemplating itself in concrete actuality. But that those manifestations of vitality on the part of individuals and peoples, in which they seek and satisfy their own purposes, are at the same time the means and instruments of a higher and broader purpose, of which they know nothing, which they realize unconsciously might be made a matter of question, rather has been questioned on this point. I announced my view at the very outset and asserted our hypothesis and our belief that reason governs the world and has consequently governed its history. In relation to this independently universal and substantial existence, all else is subordinate, subservient to it, and the means for its development. No metaphysician or theosophist could demur to these truths, which are all embodied in esoteric teachings. There is a predestination in the geological life of our globe, as in the history, past and future, of races and nations. This is closely connected with what we call karma, and what Western pantheists called nemesis and cycles. The law of evolution is now carrying us along the ascending arc of our cycle, when the effects will be once more re-merged into and re-become the now neutralized causes, and all things affected by the former will have regained their original harmony. This will be the cycle of our special round, a moment in the duration of the great cycle, or Mahayuga. The fine philosophical remarks of Hegel are found to have their application in the teachings of occult science, which shows nature ever acting with a given purpose, whose results are always dual. This was stated in our first occult volumes, in the following words: as our planet revolves once every year around the sun, and at the same time turns once in every 24 hours upon its own axis, thus traversing minor circles within a larger one, so is the work of the smaller cyclic periods accomplished and recommenced within the great seros. The revolution of the physical world, according to the ancient doctrine, is attended by a like revolution in the world of intellect, the spiritual evolution of the world proceeding in cycles, like the physical one. Thus we see in history a regular alternation of ebb and flow in the tide of human progress. The great kingdoms and empires of the world, after reaching the culmination of their greatness, descend again, in accordance with the same law by which they ascended, till, having reached the lowest point, humanity reasserts itself and mounts up once more, the height of its attainment being, by this law of ascending progression by cycles, somewhat higher than the point from which it had before descended. But these cycles, wheels within wheels, so comprehensively and ingeniously symbolized by the various Manas and Rishis in India, and by the Kabiri in the West, do not affect all mankind at one and the same time. Hence, as we see, the difficulty of comprehending and of discriminating between them, with regard to their physical and spiritual effects, without having thoroughly mastered their relations with, and action upon, the respective positions of nations and races, in their destiny and evolution. This system cannot be comprehended if the spiritual action of these periods preordained, so to say, by karmic law is separated from their physical course. The calculations of the best astrologers would fail, or at any rate remain imperfect, unless this dual action is thoroughly taken into consideration and mastered upon these lines. And this mastery can be achieved only through initiation. The grand cycle includes the progress of mankind from the appearance of primordial man of ethereal form. It runs through the inner cycles of man's progressive evolution from the ethereal down to the semi-ethereal and purely physical, down to the redemption of man from his coat of skin and matter, after which it continues running its course downward and then upward again, to meet at the culmination of a round, when the Manvantaric serpent swallows its tail and 7 minor cycles are passed. These are the great racial cycles which affect equally all the nations and tribes included in that special race, but there are minor and national, as well as tribal, cycles within these, which run their course independently of each other. They are called in Eastern esotericism the karmic cycles. In the West, since pagan wisdom has been repudiated as having grown from and been developed by the dark powers, supposed to be at constant war with, and in opposition to the little tribal Jehovah, the full and awful significance of the Greek nemesis, or karma, has been entirely forgotten. Otherwise, Christians would have better realized the profound truth that nemesis is without attributes, that while the dreaded goddess is absolute and immutable as a principle, it is we ourselves, nations and individuals, who propel it to action and give the impulse to its direction. Karma nemesis is the creator of nations and mortals, but once created, it is they who make of her either a fury or a rewarding angel. Yea, wise are they who worship Nemesis, as the chorus tells Prometheus. And as unwise they, who believe that the goddess may be propitiated by any sacrifices and prayers, or have her wheel diverted from the path it has once taken. The triform fates and ever-mindful furies are her attributes only on earth, and begotten by ourselves. There is no return from the paths she cycles over, yet those paths are of our own making, for it is we, collectively or individually, who prepare them. Karma nemesis is the synonym of providence, minus design, goodness, and every other finite attribute and qualification, so unphilosophically attributed to the latter. An occultist or a philosopher will not speak of the goodness or cruelty of providence, but, identifying it with karma nemesis, he will nevertheless teach that it guards the good and watches over them in this, as in future lives, and that it punishes the evildoer even to his seventh rebirth, so long, indeed, as the effect of his having thrown into perturbation even the smallest atom in the infinite world of harmony has not been finally readjusted. For the only decree of karma, an eternal and immutable decree, is absolute harmony in the world of matter, as it is in the world of spirit. It is not, therefore, karma that rewards or punishes, but it is we who reward or punish ourselves, according as we work with, through and along with nature, abiding by the laws on which that harmony depends, or breaking them. Nor would the ways of karma be inscrutable were men to work in union and harmony, instead of disunion and strife. For our ignorance of these ways, which one portion of mankind calls the ways of providence, dark and intricate, while another sees in them the action of blind fatalism, and a third simple chance, with neither gods nor devils to guide them, would surely disappear, if we would but attribute all of them to their correct cause. With right knowledge, or at any rate with a confident conviction that our neighbors would no more work to hurt us than we would think of harming them, 2/3 of the world's evil would vanish into thin air. Were no man to hurt his brother, karma nemesis would have neither cause to work for, nor weapons to act through. It is the constant presence in our midst of every element of strife and opposition, and the division of races, nations, tribes, societies and individuals into Cains and Abels, wolves and lambs, that is the chief cause of the ways of providence. We cut these numerous windings in our destinies daily with our own hands, while we imagine that we are pursuing a track on the royal high road of respectability and duty, and then we complain because these windings are so intricate and so dark. We stand bewildered before the mystery of our own making, and the riddles of life that we will not solve, and then accuse the great Sphinx of devouring us. But verily there is not an accident in our lives, not a misshapen day, or a misfortune, that could not be traced back to our own doings in this or in another life. If one breaks the laws of harmony, or, as a theosophical writer expresses it, the laws of life one must be prepared to fall into the chaos oneself has produced. 4. According to the same writer, the only conclusion one can come to is that these laws of life are their own avengers, and consequently that every avenging angel is only a typified representation of their reaction. Therefore, if anyone is helpless before these immutable laws, it is not ourselves, the artificers of our destinies, but rather those angels, the guardians of harmony. Karma nemesis is no more than the spiritual dynamical effect of causes produced and forces awakened into activity by our own actions. It is a law of occult dynamics that a given amount of energy expended on the spiritual or astral plane is productive of far greater results than the same amount expended on the physical objective plane of existence. This condition of things will last till man's spiritual intuitions are fully opened, and this will not be until we fairly cast off our thick coats of matter, until we begin acting from within, instead of ever following impulses from without, impulses produced by our physical senses and gross selfish body. Until then, the only palliatives for the evils of life are union and harmony, a brotherhood in active, and altruism not simply in name. The suppression of one single bad cause will suppress not one, but many bad effects. And if a brotherhood, or even a number of brotherhoods, may not be able to prevent nations from occasionally cutting each other's throats, still unity in thought and action, and philosophical research into the mysteries of being, will always prevent some persons, who are trying to comprehend that which has hitherto remained to them a riddle, from creating additional causes of mischief in a world already so full of woe and evil. Knowledge of karma gives the conviction that if virtue in distress, and vice in triumph make atheists of mankind, it is only because mankind has ever shut its eyes to the great truth that man is himself his own savior and his own destroyer. He need not accuse heaven and the gods, fates and providence, of the apparent injustice that reigns in the midst of humanity. But let him rather remember and repeat this fragment of Grecian wisdom, which warns man to forbear accusing that which just, though mysterious, leads us on unerring through ways unmarked from guilt to punishment, and such are now the ways on which the great European nations move onward. Every nation and tribe of the Western Aryans, like their Eastern brethren of the fifth race, has had its golden and its iron age, its period of comparative irresponsibility, or its Satya age of purity, and now, several of them have reached their iron age, the Kali Yuga, an age black with horrors. On the other hand, it is true that the exoteric cycles of every nation have been rightly derived from, and shown to depend on, sidereal motions. The latter are inseparably blended with the destinies of nations and men. But, in the purely physical sense, Europe knows of no cycles other than the astronomical, and it makes its computations accordingly. Nor will it hear of any other than imaginary circles or circuits in the starry heavens that gird them, with centric and eccentric scribbled or cycle and epicycle, orb and orb. But with the pagans, of whom Coleridge rightly says, time, cyclical time, was their abstraction of the deity, that deity manifesting coordinately with, and only through, karma, and being that karma nemesis itself, the cycles, meant something more than a mere succession of events, or a periodical space of time of more or less prolonged duration. For they were generally marked with recurrences of a more varied and intellectual character than are exhibited in the periodical return of seasons or of certain constellations. Modern wisdom is satisfied with astronomical computations and prophecies based on unerring mathematical laws. Ancient wisdom added to the cold shell of astronomy the vivifying elements of its soul and spirit astrology. And, as the sidereal motions do regulate and determine other events on Earth besides potatoes and the periodical diseases of that useful vegetable estate which, not being amenable to scientific explanation, is merely derided, while nonetheless accepted, these events have to submit to predetermination by simple astronomical computations. Believers in astrology will understand our meaning. Skeptics will laugh at the belief and mock the idea. Thus they shut their eyes, ostrich-like, to their own fate. This because their little historical period, so-called, allows them no margin for comparison. Sidereal heaven is before them, and though their spiritual vision is still unopened, and the atmospheric dust of terrestrial origin seals their sight and chains it within the limits of physical systems, still they do not fail to perceive the movements and note the behavior of meteors and comets. They record the periodical advents of those wanderers and flaming messengers and prophecy, in consequence, earthquakes, meteoric showers, the apparition of certain stars, comets, etc. Are they, then, soothsayers after all? No, they are learned astronomers. Why, then, should occultists and astrologers, as learned as these astronomers, be disbelieved when they prophesy the return of some cyclic event on the same mathematical principles? Why should the claim that they know this return be ridiculed? Their forefathers and predecessors, having recorded the recurrence of such events in their time and day, throughout a period embracing hundreds of thousands of years. The conjunction of the same constellations must necessarily produce, if not quite the same, at any rate similar, effects. Are the prophecies to be derided because of the claim made for hundreds of thousands of years of observation, and for millions of years for the human races? In its turn, modern science is laughed at by those who hold to biblical chronology for its far more modest geological and anthropological figures. Thus karma adjusts even human laughter at the mutual expense of sects, learned societies, and individuals. Yet in the prognostication of such future events, at any rate, all foretold on the authority of cyclic recurrences, no psychic phenomenon is involved. It is neither prevision nor prophecy, any more than is the signaling of a comet or star several years before its appearance. It is simply knowledge and mathematically correct computations which enabled the wise men of the East to foretell, for instance, that England is on the eve of such or another catastrophe, that France is nearing such a point of her cycle, and that Europe in general is threatened with, or rather is on the eve of, a cataclysm to which her own cycle of racial karma has led her. Our view of the reliability of the information depends, of course, on our acceptation or rejection of the claim for a tremendous period of historical observation. Eastern initiates maintain that they have preserved records of racial development and of events of universal import ever since the beginning of the fourth race, their knowledge of events preceding that epoch being traditional. Moreover, those who believe in seership and in occult powers will have no difficulty in crediting the general character, at least, of the information given, even if it be traditional, once the tradition is checked and corrected by clairvoyance and esoteric knowledge. But in the present case, no such metaphysical belief is claimed as our chief dependence, for proof is given on what, to every occultist, is quite scientific evidence: the records preserved through the zodiac for incalculable ages. It is now amply proved that even horoscopes and judiciary astrology are not quite based on fiction, and that stars and constellations, consequently, have an occult and mysterious influence on, and connection with, individuals. And if with the latter, why not with nations, races, and mankind as a whole? This, again, is a claim made on the authority of the zodiacal records. We shall then inquire how far the zodiac was known to the ancients, and how far it is forgotten by the moderns. And that's not all. Our experts and regular viewers respond to all comments. Also check if you forgot to subscribe and set your bell to receive notifications about new audiobooks and other useful self-development materials that we release regularly. Join in the discussions, don't forget to give likes and, if possible and inspired, support the development of the channel financially. All useful links will be in the description and the first attached comment. Goodness, love and wisdom to all. And now move on to watch the next part of the video at the links below, or choose something from the playlists of the channel and those you see on the screen.